so
Ditto.
funny.
That was great. Well, I was glad that you read that section, because one of the things that I was most fascinated by in Green Girl was how you had structured it and how you had that kind of authorial narration where at the very beginning we actually see Ruth come into being.
Right.
And I was wondering if that was something that you had from the beginning, or if that structure evolved.
I don't know. Can you hear me like this, or do I need to talk into the microphone? I'll talk into the microphone. Okay.
You can hold it like a singer.
Oh, I think that yeah, I can have all of it. Yeah, I think when I first started writing the work, it was a kind of a work about loneliness and alienation in the city and consumerism. And then as the work evolved, I wanted to have more distance from the character in order to sort of meditate on other things. I wanted to write a third-person interiority and actually get inside Ruth's interiority, but also do something different than a sort of omniscient narrator. I wanted a narrator who's kind of creating the whole thing and essaying on the whole thing. And the work began to be very much an elegy to youth, I think, as well as a meditation on literature and the act of writing. It evolved over time. I was really inspired by Hour of the Star, by the Clarice Lispector's male writer, Rodrigo S.M., and how she has the narrator be a real fictional character. And then also Marguerite Duras' The Lover. I was reading a lot of Elfriede Jelinek at the time, where she very much treats her characters as puppets, as grotesque. And I was interested in that, but doing that in a way that was more tender than just viewing characters as symptomatic of their class or gender or situation in life.
Well, I thought that it was very interesting because obviously the voice, the authorial voice, knows everything about this creation of hers. But we get this range of emotion that you wouldn't expect from that feeling of omniscience. So we get times that she's tender towards her, we get times that she's prickly and frustrated with her, and I think it's the character of Ruth is talked about often as being blank or a question mark or not yet knowing who she is, and so what I liked about having that other perspective was it felt like we had this way into her thoughts that sometimes she didn't even know that she was having.
Right.
So I thought that was a really useful device.
Well, I was really interested too in, and hopefully we can talk about your book and walking too, but I was really interested in, speaking of walking, in I think characters that really inspired me were Duras' zombie heroine, Milstein, and how Milstein is this kind of a minor celebrity in her town, and she's walking around in this sort of amnesic consciousness, haunted by the past, and seems like a cipher. And we don't really get much of Milstein's interiority except her violent desires at times, or Robin Vote in Nightwood, another cipher. So I was interested in somehow writing this sort of wandering figure who felt quite intensely. She felt intensely, and then the writer commenting on her feels quite intensely for her.
Well, it does seem like the role, in fact, in both the books of yours I read, Green Girl and in Heroines, the city itself, I mean, it's London in Green Girl, but it's Akron, Ohio, and also feels like it's Durham, North Carolina, and a little bit of Chicago.
Yeah.
But there's this sense, and I think of this as someone who lived in New York for many years, that you can still be self-contained in a city, and yet you're not in a bubble, because you have all of that information coming at you from all sorts of people. I mean, I have a little passage in Department of Speculation that talks about why people supposedly are more nervous in cities, and it's about how when you can't hear birds sing, that it triggers something in your brain about it's not a safe place because the birds get quiet. And I thought that I wanted to talk about that idea of walking around, and if that's part of your composition process as well as part of what you have your characters do. Because I always have a assignment when I teach my courses. I write on the board Solvitur ambulando, solve it by walking. And it's funny, I've been teaching for many years, and this has gotten harder and harder for the students to do, but I make them leave all their things in the room, the phones and everything, and then they have to go out and think about one of the works there, and they can't spend money, and they can't talk to anyone. And it's really interesting because some of them panic. They really panic to be alone in their head.
Yes.
That much.
That solitude is intensely necessary to be a writer.
Well, that's sort of my didactic point.
Well, I really love, and I think we share, because we were talking, I think we talk so much
in our whole
upstairs.
conversation.
But really inspired by novels, literature of the walker, and I think what is intriguing about a work like Robert Walser's The Walk is that the narrator is always a writer. I mean, in a lot of these works, the narrator is a writer, and the narrator leaves the solitude and writer's block of the room, and then goes out to the space outside. So I think for these works of the walker, there's this interesting blend of interiority and this sort of external landscape, and trying to negotiate both of them.
Yeah, I think there's something too about, I know so many writers that like to live in cities and like to walk around as a thing, and I think part of it is that in some strange way, for me at least, it's like reading.
Yes.
Like I can still be completely in my own head, but I can feel like there's some kind of conversation going on around me, or some kind of feeling of some kind of an emotional force field that I can enter into.
Exactly. And I think you asked whether this inspired Green Girl, and I think I was really inspired by the flaneur and like Arcade's project and Benjamin writing on the flaneur, and I was interested in the figure of the walker, but it's only recently I've really began to think of writing as walking, and how I want what I write, and this is what you perform so beautifully, to have the feeling of wandering to it. So not only wandering as a mode, but also that work to have that sense of not knowing exactly where you're going, and this sort of driftingness and wandering to it.
I think one of the things I know I thought about in the composition of my novel, and I was wondering if you had some of these thoughts too, that when you're writing something that is going to follow a wandering course, how do you keep it from feeling random? How do you make it feel constructed, even though that element of surprise and of chance is actually central to it?
Right. I think that, I'm really, even though I'm kind of recommitted to the novel and thinking really about the novel, I'm really personally inspired by the essay. This idea of an essay in the mode of Montaigne, to begin not knowing, to begin with the sort of stance of not knowing. So not necessarily I'm just going to go everywhere, but this stance of doubt and being unsure. But I think that can inform some of the movement. But it's, I think that the walk is, even though the walk, Walser's The Walk seems so organic, I would imagine it's highly edited and stylized. It has that feel of the everyday to it, and the feel of the diaristic to it. But Walser, I don't even understand Walser's process, but he rewrote his sentences over and over and over and over.
Yeah, well, I feel like one of the things that I think is interesting in Robert Walser's work is he calls his stories the little rambles, and at the end of one that's called A Little Ramble, there's a line that sort of tells you in a way how to read him. It says, "We don't need to see anything out of the ordinary. We already see so much." And then later in an essay he wrote on Thoughts on Cézanne, he talks about how what makes him fascinating as a painter is that he doesn't separate into a different temple, like the small and the large, that he believes that there can be this crossover. And so I was wondering about that movement that is found in a lot of philosophical novels and in the European tradition of moving from what we think of as the everyday to the more ecstatic. And I felt like there were moments like that in Green Girl, certainly in Heroines as well.
It's so funny you said that, because I was a line that I've been thinking about a lot lately is from Rilke's Letters to Cezanne, where he says, he writes to Clara, right? He writes, one lives so badly that one goes into the present unfinished, unable, distracted. And so I'm really interested lately in attempting to write the everyday, but kind of the impossibility of it as well. But I definitely agree with Walzer that the everyday there's everything there to attempt to write about. I think that for me, in terms of what I like to read about, why I loved your work so much, I mean, is I think this aspect of intimacy and the everyday and the sort of experiences of tremendous feeling that's possible in everyday experience. And I don't know, I'm always trying to figure, I mean, just as a person, I'm always trying to figure out the day, like the tyranny of the day, like how can one be alone? You know, how is one alone? How do you deal with solitude? Meditating on existence, and I think that's all the stuff of, for me, some of my favorite works that I read that are probably in more of that European philosophical tradition of an essayistic consciousness.
Why do you think there's less of that kind of essayistic fiction in America? Do you think there's something about the way Americans look at literary works that goes for a more straight realism or conventional linear?
Yeah, I have a really cynical view of that. I mean, I don't know if I'm right, but I've been nursing this theory for a while. That's kind of probably paranoid and bananas, but I've been thinking a lot about the 19th century, which I love the 19th century. I love novels of the 19th century, but I got into a fight with a friend of mine. We both had insomnia, and we were G-chatting each other, and he was saying how Henry James is the greatest novelist, and I said, you are my mortal enemy. We actually haven't spoken since then. It was like a week ago. I was explaining.
I like that that's what G-chat is being used for somehow.
And we also talked about porn. It was like porn and Henry James. It felt very appropriate. We were talking about
modern.
How can writers be alone? I mean, that's the question of it's a question of the human, but it's also the question very acutely of someone who's supposed to stay in a room or go walk out into the crowds and be alone. But I don't know, I think that perhaps highly discursive novels are not seen as tremendously marketable. And also I think that, and I'm really curious about what you think about this in terms of what I loved about the narrator in Department of Speculation is how she was earnestly seeking some sort of help from outside, whether it be philosophy, the Stoics, yoga, but that the work didn't have this sense of self-help to it, that it wasn't about, it wasn't, but it was more, I mean, it's more like that Rilke quote, the sense of living life intensely yet badly. I think that's the only, to me that's realism. But I think that a lot of these works, by what I kind of think of as the great haters, like Thomas Bernhard, like Balzer, like Jean Rhys, who's a truly great hater. I mean, it's not really it's not very uplifting, I think that, it's not very moral. The characters are intensely unlikable, often. I mean, do we really like Bernhard's characters, or?
I think the whole idea of likability is, in some ways, feels like a pretty American idea. I noticed when one of the times George Bush was running for president, and there were all these people, when they were being interviewed about it, they were being asked, would you like to go have a beer with him, or would you like to go have a beer with John Kerry? And people were like, yeah, I'd rather have a beer with him. I think he seems more like a regular guy. And I was thinking, he's gonna run the like free world. Like, it doesn't matter if he's like good to go have a beer with.
Well, the idea of sentimentality in terms of how we pick our American presidents. I mean, but it's very much a capitalist idea, I think, in terms of, I kind of connect this sort of, this interest in realism now with the 19th century novel, which were hugely popular in the marketplace in the 19th century, so English and American. And yeah, I think those works were supposed to be intensely moral. I mean, I love George Eliot. I do tolerate Henry James. You know, but their works were supposed to provide deep empathy, which is often a way we still speak about literature as teaching empathy. And they were supposed to be deeply moral, right? They were supposed to, and I think a lot of these works of essayistic consciousness they can be humanist, but that's not their aim necessarily. Like Dostoevsky's Underground has a pretty bleak view of existence, or even Pessoa's Book of Disquiet.
One of the things I was wondering about with Green Girl at the end, it ends with her talking about screaming and screaming and screaming. And also in Heroines, at the end, it sort of turns into almost a brief manifesto moment where it talks about, you know, the last line is like, after all, we have to become our own heroines. Yeah. But there's a moment before then which talks about, let's push back at this canon, let's push back at these ideas, and let's scream and let's shout and let's singe. And I was wondering about that idea of the scream. It is interesting to me that it was at the end of both books, because that's obviously the archetype of the mad woman, you know, screaming in the attic or something. So I was wondering if you consciously had that echo, or if it was... No, I just know I didn't consciously. I think it's probably in all my works. I mean, the last line, after all, we must be our own heroines, I'm kind of saying, to use a term from Department of Speculation, that we need to be our own art monsters, you know, that we need that people who have felt silence need to actually, or were taken as characters historically who were silenced, to write that version yourself. Not that everyone should necessarily write novels, but just this idea... Don't do it.
Yeah, but just this idea of writing as a form of subjectivity, which I believe in very much, reading and writing. And but yeah, I think it's more... I think I meant the end to be more... I meant it to be empowering, but I think I also meant just kind of to be provocative at the end. I don't know, I guess the ideas of screaming show up in a lot in my work. I mean, this poetry work I have coming out, Helene Weigel's Silent Scream in Mother Courage, is a reoccurring image. And I'm just really interested in, and I think you perform this so well in your book, this modulation of silence and then moments of intense rage. And I think, you know, I'm very interested in silence in writing, in the fragment, but I'm also very interested in the rant, which is kind of the scream, the impotent scream, the violent scream, the mad rant in literature.
So you embrace the term rant. You don't.
It's
been used so dismissively. So.
I know. I've heard that. I mean,
like, could you just rant right now? If I was like, give a rant, would you have a rant?
I'm not really a ranter, really. I'm a pretty quiet person. No, but yeah, I think for me the best, like, David Wojnarowicz is Close to the Knives, which is this, you know, the book of essays becomes like a disintegrating body, where he's just raging against the government and raging against his body consumed by AIDS and against hypocrisy. I mean, I think there's a lot of what's not talked about in writing in America now is writing that's deeply political, and that is about alienation and is about something larger than the self. And I think the novel is a really great place for a rant, like the Bernhard rant, because the genius of Bernhard is that his narrators are assholes too. Like they're deeply fraudulent and slippery. And I think the novel allows more for that idea of this unreliable narrator. Did you think about the idea of the slipperiness or unreliability of your narrator?
Well, I always wanted there to be a continuum of sort of all this range of emotion, from dread to anger to longing to happiness. But I don't think for me, I wanted it to have a musicality, and I was in some ways I was more following that in some ways. I was talking to someone joking after an interview about how you like reverse engineer your book afterwards when you go out and you're like, well, I was mostly influenced by blah blah blah. But at the time you're just like, I like that sound. It's pretty.
Yeah. When your work is so fragmented, this work, although there are these longer passages, and it's modulated so musically. I think that's really, it's an incredible performance of voice and feeling, which is what I'm really interested in reading.
I had a chance to read a little bit of the newest work that Kate's doing, the novel in progress, which was great. And the working title is Drifts, but there's a new.
Well, I'm thinking them like formally as Drifts, but I feel like Drift is like the name of like. It's like a novel it's like a book about war or something, but it's called Switzerland.
Okay. But I noticed that it's gotten so much more fragmentary than Green Girl. And I was wondering about what you find that you can do with the fragment that maybe in a more linear narrative you feel constrained by.
Well, yeah, I don't think of Green Girl as necessarily linear. I was reading this interview.
It's only linear kind of in a chronological way. There's that coming in and out, I guess.
It's like episodic. I was reading an interview with Alexander Hemon and Teo Cole where he was talking about Open City, and Hemon said the city is nonlinear, which I really like that. That works of the city are somehow like maps somehow that are nonlinear. But yeah, my work is getting increasingly fragmented and increasingly more inspired by the lyric essay, while still I think of heroines I framed as nonfiction, and I decided that in terms of the reading of it, that in nonfiction you're really not supposed to have a heightened or unreliable narrator, which I thought I had. So it's kind of, I was really, I didn't really want to read Jenny's work for a long time because I was like, oh my god, I thought I'd be really jealous, but instead it was this beautiful performance. I was really happy to read it. It was quite joyful to read.
It's funny to whenever you sort of hear tell of someone who sounds like they're writing something similar.
It was like Wittgenstein's Mistress, people were saying, Speedboat, and all the things people say,
Yeah, we were saying that, I was thinking, the Germans probably have a word for it, but I feel like there should be a word for when you're told that you're like incredibly influenced and ripping off books that you haven't read.
I know,
because I keep getting told in my reviews that I've been incredibly influenced by Elizabeth Hardwick's Sleepless Nights, which I've never read. And,
which is amazing.
I'm sure it's really great, amazing,
yeah.
But I haven't
Your work is very, very
I haven't
different.
read it for exactly that reason. At some point I saw it and saw that it sounded...
Well, I think people see like fragment, they see something that's deeply anecdotal, which I think is so brilliant about your work. I love works that are anecdotal like that, and they kind of...
Are you using the anecdote? It seemed like you were at the part that...
I think Heroines is very anecdotal. I'm very interested in this idea of these. It's called Switzerland because it's the inspiration. It's again very deeply metafictional, but I'm very inspired by like the Romantic poets, Shelley and Byron and Switzerland, Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein, and Nietzsche and Lou Andreas Salome in Switzerland. But it's a lot of like stories again about writers, about literature, deeply invested in literature. And I think what I love too about your work is it was something I always look for in what I read or what I want to try to write, and maybe this plays into the fragment, is the idea of a library of the mind at work. which I really thought your work did so beautifully.
I think my head that's mostly filled with books. My books are made from other books. But I think that one of the things I was really intrigued by that you said a little earlier before we came on was that Heroines had originally been a novel.
Yeah.
So what made you change it to a more of a, although it's a very capacious, like it has all these different, it has literary theory, but it also has memoir, it also has all these things. What made you kind of make the hybrid form?
To be honest, I mean, I was kind of like this very unpublished writer who knew no one in publishing whatsoever, who was squirreling away manuscripts at that point. I mean, Green Girl had been rejected by hundreds of places, and I was kind of like, oh, this is my life, I'm going to be unpublished for the rest of my life. I loved, the outsider artist Henry Darger or Pessoa, and it made sense to me. It felt okay. But I was working on this,
Someone will find it one day.
I was just like, maybe I'll be a famous diarist, those kind of, because I write, the diary is kind of what I'm most interested in a way. And Heroines came very deeply out of the diary, out of writing the everyday. But I had this work for a long time, and I wrote. Sometimes the story is that like the book came from my blog, but I wrote like one post on my blog. I started a blog because I was living in Akron, Ohio. I felt like 10 people were reading it, and I posted a blog post, and Chris Cross, who wrote the great novel I Love Dick and who runs Semiotext, she had blurbed my first mini novella that came out, and she read it, and she was like, hey, would you want to write a nonfiction book? And like, I'm writing a novel. She's like, no, we want to publish it as a nonfiction book. I was like, okay.
So it had already been completely conceived in?
No, part one was almost finished.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah, and then I spent a long time rewriting it.
How did you have to shift your vision of it? I mean, what can a novel contain that a work of nonfiction can't, and vice versa?
It's a really good question. It's something that's really evolving for me. I mean, I love works that are about this sort of essayistic consciousness, but I think in today's marketplace, and I do think this is pretty American, we have very strict boundaries between nonfiction and fiction. And I think with nonfiction, you're expected to have much more of a reliable narrator who kind of knows everything. And I'm not really interested in knowing everything or kind of approaching from that position. I much more appreciate, and I love this about your work, kind of a work that's about books, but in a voluptuous, kind of very embodied, sensual way. And so I think with nonfiction, the writer is the narrator, period. And it's a very clear line. I think with fiction, there's more potential for slipperiness with the narrator, possibly.
Is it possible that the book you're writing now may jump genres, or does it feel?
Well, it's all
enough?
jump genre. I mean,
Okay.
I mean, I think of all my work as the same.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it's, for me, when you write something, it becomes fiction. Mm-hmm. And that the act of, the notion even that there's a coherent self is a fiction. Mm-hmm. That memory is a fiction, that any idea of a fixed truth is kind of flawed for just in terms of my, the subjectivity I'm interested in. So like Jean Rhys wrote from her diary and she wrote from her life, but she always said, my books have shape where life does not have shape. And
right.
There's no one who edited herself more than Jean Rhys, winnowed away until her works were incredibly musical. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's a question that I think is maybe asked a lot, but kind of doesn't really connect as much to my projects.
Mm-hmm. Now with Heroines, because you're talking about women, these modernist wives, these mad wives, who have been in some ways erased. In fact, the story of T.S. Eliot's wife is one of the ones that really I was particularly taken with, and she's basically sort of written out of his life at a certain point, and we hear this refrain, suppress the suppressible. and you were saying
Suppress everything suppressible.
suppress everything
Yeah.
suppressible. And so it starts to kind of vanish what her story was, and you couldn't get access to her notebooks.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't try that hard, but
Yeah.
yeah, I couldn't get access to the Bodleian library.
But-
well, because Valerie Elliott owns the Elliott estate, which includes T.S. Eliot's first
Oh.
wife. I mean, now she's
Yeah.
dead. She's dead.
So now
I don't know.
but it seems like the part of bringing out voices that had been silenced or hadn't heard, the feminist project of that, that became sort of a thing that surrounded heroines. And I was wondering what it felt like to be sort of put on stage as you put it, as a professional feminist, you know, from that.
Yeah, it was weird because I guess I never approached what I wrote as, I mean, I definitely identify as a feminist in my life and who I am as a person, who I am as a teacher, but I never viewed heroines as, I think honestly when you review a work that was literary, which is what I always considered heroines to be, if you review it for its identity politics or its politics, it kind of loses something. That you can read something for whether it's feminist enough, that also there's the other end of whether it's too feminist, unfeminist. She's the spokesperson of the feminists. Yeah, I mean,
people saying it was too feminist, it was not feminist enough.
Yeah, both. Too feminist, not feminist enough.